Everybody. Welcome to another installment of A Rebel Without Applause, coming to you as I always do from my little nutshell of infinite space right here in the Wood of the Holly. We're just coming out of a massive rainstorm, but the sun is shining. And on the other side of this digital divide is a really incredibly brilliant guest. He is a brainiac of the highest order, living at the absolute pinnacle of academia. I'm going to go over his credits quickly. He went to where did he go? He went to Yale and he got his PhD from Columbia. He lives in New York. He enjoyed editorial stints at the New Republic, at Slate. He is a history and journalism professor at the home of that All-American football player, Paul Robeson. That's Rutgers University. He's made a big study of U.S. presidents, and now most recently, he's completed a book about John Lewis. He's with me on the other side. Welcome, David Greenberg. How are you?
Thank you, Bill. Nice to be with you.
Oh, thank you. So let's kick this thing off. You've written quite a bit about American presidents, I noticed. Richard Nixon and Calvin Coolidge. I don't know if there's a similarity that can be drawn between them, but you've made a recent departure from presidents to a congressman named John Lewis. So why John Lewis?
Well, I had finished my last book, which was called Republic of Spin, and published it in 2016. And this, of course, was right around the time Trump was coming up. And Republic of Spin, really, it's a history of the White House spin machine. I start really with Teddy Roosevelt, even a bit on William McKinley right before him, and I trace it all the way through Obama. Trump is actually not in the book. I finished the manuscript at the end of 2014, so Trump wasn't running yet. And when I went on book tour, of course, all the questions are about Trump. And I did start to think, well, how do I fit Trump into this story? And people started saying, oh, you should do your next book on Trump. You should do an epilogue, for the paperback that would deal with Trump. I even had a title, Beyond Spin. It was going to be Beyond Spin, truthful hyperbole, alternative facts, and some other euphemism that Trump had for lying. But at the end, I felt so kind of, as a citizen, oppressed and beaten down by the constant dealing with Trump and thinking about Trump. And I was still, I still do a lot of journalism, writing pieces for Politico and elsewhere, writing about Trump to some degree. I really thought to myself, I want to do something different for my next book. Like, I don't want to do Trump. I get enough Trump as it is. And I happened to be watching a Netflix documentary about Bobby Kennedy, and on comes John Lewis as a talking head. And it turns out that Mr. Lewis had, and I sometimes call him Mr. Lewis, that's what his staff and a lot of people call him. Other people call him John. Maybe I'll slip into that too. But that John Lewis had worked for Bobby Kennedy in the 68 campaign. I think I must have known this. It's in the memoir, but I had forgotten it. This intrigued me. And right around this time, John Lewis was actually popping up in the news a lot. It was like Americans were turning to him as an antidote for all that was kind of ugly and toxic in Trump's America. And a kind of light went on, and I thought, I don't think there's a proper biography of John Lewis. And I went online. There were a number of children's books about him,
He
but no
published
biographies.
he published a picture book, or sort of a extended cartoon book. I don't know what the right word would be.
Yeah, right. The graphic.
Graphic.
Sometimes you can say graphic novel. Technically, it's not a novel; it's a graphic memoir. But right, he did his own graphic memoir in 3 parts called March. There's others. Some of his favorite stories, like when he would preach to the chickens as a young boy, that was made into a children's book. And of course, he has his memoir, Walking with the Wind from the 90s,
Hmm.
which is excellent in its own right. But
Yeah.
there was no proper biography. And I thought, well, now's sort of the time to do it, isn't it? He was coming to the end of his congressional career. Of course, he was still alive when I began, and I had no idea he would die so soon. Um, but I did sort of think this is the time when I will have access to a lot of the historical archives, but also access to interviews with many, many people who knew him and worked with him and so on. And so as someone who's always been interested in the recent past and done a form of history that is kind of contiguous with journalism, John Lewis calls it contemporary history. Um, I thought, yeah, this is an assignment I should take on, and worked up a book proposal. My editor at Simon and Schuster said when he received his proposal, received my proposal, the first thing he did was go online, look at Amazon. Is there a John Lewis biography? No. So he got excited over it as well.
So to me, when I think about John Lewis, because as I mentioned to you earlier, you and I have covered some of the same narrative territory. Myself as a screenwriter, and you as a biographer. When I think about John Lewis, the thing that just leaps out to me is that his notion of this Gandhian idea of nonviolence or satyagraha, and using this sort of soul force as a tool, as a lever to unlock these core problems in the American society, specifically prejudice, segregation. And he really is maybe the main person in that test tube to use these tools to first unlock what happens in Nashville. I'm sure that's a core piece of your story. And then this is beyond the scope of what I wrote, but then his ideas are tested in the real world of American politics, first in 1963, or first maybe in SNCC, in the jail with Stokely Carmichael, his roommate. Then in 1963, when he's with the Big Six and he's got this speech that he wants to deliver, and you wrote brilliantly about it in the op-ed that was published in the New York Times. That's how you came to my attention. And then later. So I just want you to react to that, because to me, I mean, he's a congressman. He doesn't have his name on a lot of bills. Uh, he's one of what, I don't know how many are there, 400 of them, but yet he's one of the most important figures of the 20th century. And for me, that's the reason why. But you can expand or disagree or whatever. I want to hear.
Yeah, well, let me say a few things. I mean, absolutely, John Lewis's years in the movement, say from 1960, which is the first sit-ins, which he's a part of. The very first ones are in Greensboro, North Carolina. But within a few days, his group of students in Nashville, which had been preparing to do something similar, jumps in. And as people may know, these sit-ins start spreading from one college town to another across the South, as Black students, often arm in arm with white students, will go to lunch counters, Woolworths and other places, and sit down to desegregate these Jim Crow lunch counters. So it sort of starts in 1960, and with Lewis, it's amazing how many of the core critical moments of the early 60s movement he's a part of. The Freedom Rides, which we can talk about in 1961, to desegregate bus travel, interstate bus travel. In 1963, as you said, the March on Washington. He's there 64 for Freedom Summer, the Mississippi Summer, to organize Mississippians, Black Mississippians, to vote and to press their case then at the Democratic Convention that summer. And then, of course, probably most famously for John Lewis in 1965, during the voting rights drive in Selma, Alabama, which ultimately leads, well, immediately to his getting the life beaten out of him and being sort of nearly killed on the bridge. But then ultimately leads to the passage of the Voting Rights Act in the summer of '65. So John Lewis, as a very young man, he's born in 1940. So from ages to 20 to 25, he's a central part of, 5 or 6 key moments in our history. It's really an amazing life, even by the age of 25. Um, in all those years, his friends, colleagues in SNCC, people like Martin Luther King, James Lawson, who was his teacher, another minister who really held the workshops in Nashville for people to learn the method and discipline of nonviolence. They all say that of everyone in the movement, John Lewis learned and believed in the tenets of satyagraha, nonviolence, as deeply and completely as anyone. For many of the students, probably for most of the students, nonviolence was a tactic. They didn't they didn't believe it to their bones. So it was useful if they would get beat up at a lunch counter by these white ruffians who came into the store. That made for good television, made for photographs in Life magazine that would mobilize sympathy around the country. But they didn't necessarily believe ultimately this will win over the hearts of their antagonists. But John Lewis did. He believed this to his bones, and he believed in what King and Lawson, in a term that actually goes back to the early 20th century, called the beloved community. That he thought these nonviolence, as he said, as a philosophy and a way of life, not just as a tactic, could bring about a society where, regardless of race, regardless of other differences, we could all love one another and live in a kind of harmony. Obviously, it's a somewhat more than somewhat, it's a utopian vision. And he was realistic enough to know that it wasn't, going to be achieved anytime soon.
Mhm.
But he never stopped believing in it. And then just to come back to the piece about his political career, and we can talk about this more too, he really did bring it into politics. And there's a little bit of a contradiction there because politics is the art of the possible, and politics relies on pragmatism. And John Lewis was a very pragmatic politician. I read something this weekend that said that Bill Clinton's pragmatism left him cold. Completely false. He loved Bill Clinton, thought he was a great president, was one of his close allies. Sure, there were individual decisions that Clinton made that Lewis disagreed with quite forcefully, particularly a crime bill that included death penalty provisions, and Lewis was strongly anti-death penalty. But he became a very canny, sophisticated politician. And yet, some of the tools and ideals and methods that he learned in the movement remained with him. So for example, in 2016, I got this great story from David Cicilline, who was a Rhode Island congressman. Um, they wanted to do something about gun violence in the wake of a nightclub shooting in Orlando, Florida. And Lewis was in a group where they were talking about what they could do strategically. And someone said, maybe Cicilline himself, why don't we each go up to the well and make our speech? But then when we're done, just stand there and refuse to go back to our seats. And then John Lewis says, and better yet, we could all then sit down. And Cicilline said that was it. Like in a moment, Lewis tied together the historical resonance of the sit-in and that strategy to the current problem. And it got all this attention, a sit-in on the House floor. And so, even into his later days, he was using what he learned in the movement to bring it into politics, even as he was also succeeding as a politician.
I remember that now. The thing about law, I'm going to go back and think about Lewis because he took some major beatings, and I tried to think, what are the major beatings? And I would say that first leg of the Freedom Ride, he goes into South Carolina, he gets punched out in the bus depot,
Rock Hill, right?
Rock Hill, South Carolina. And, as I mentioned, I wrote a screenplay, and that's a scene. And the moment that I thought about afterwards, when you write a screenplay, some of the stuff you got to make up. What are they saying alone in their room? Sorry, I got to think about it. I know that he got confronted, by these ruffians, and he gets punched out. And then I wrote a scene shortly after that in the little lodge or hotel room where they're staying. I think that was, one of the first night or so after they begin the journey from Washington. And his friend or roommate, I forget, he's a real character, says, "Well, did it hurt? You got punched." And I thought, no, it actually felt like I was close to God. Like I felt a connection with Jesus. I feel like the beatings that he took. Let's see. The next one in my mind is in Montgomery when the bus arrives and he gets smashed. And I'm going to just say, well, what did I got to write that? That's actually one of the prologue scenes in the actual story. And I felt like, okay, he's got this new weapon. It's like, I'm going to love the person that hates my guts. I'm
Exactly.
taking, Jesus isn't saying, when he says turn the other cheek, he's not speaking metaphorically. No, turn the other cheek. The guy punched you on this cheek, give him the other one. But look at him like I love you. It's like a dare. And so the scene that I wrote is this guy is approaching him, I think, with like a crate or something,
Yes.
and he freezes him with his look. It's like a ray gun,
Right.
and he's frozen. Like this guy is not fuck you, all the other shit that we do. And the guy freezes him, and then out of the corner, somebody else clocks him on the head. And there's all those famous photos, with the bandages there.
Right.
And then I guess the last big one that I know would be Selma, right? The bridge, but that's some years later, 1965. But the idea that I had about him, and it's not because he said it, it's just because I felt it, was that these moments, like it's his turn on the cross, and it's like a hugely emotional and fulfilling experience, almost like when a boxer gets in the ring. They don't feel the pain. It's something else. And that's my imaginary leap, but I felt like I was pretty close, to something that was real.
I think that's really right on. I mean, he talks about in other moments not necessarily getting hit, but when he goes to jail for the first time, he
Mhm.
talks about it as exhilarating. um, that there is a sense it's working. The nonviolent discipline is working because, of course, with the jailing, they fill up the jails, and it then mobilizes the community, and it's part of the process that is bringing about this more equal society. And I think, of course, the same is true with the violence. I mean, he has described what he experienced. As I think about it, I'm not sure he uses the word pain. I mean, he'll talk about, um, you know, the room spinning, or the sky spinning around him. He'll talk about, feeling the crushing blow come down. But it's interesting. I'm not sure he uses the word pain. And certainly the idea is he's still going to feel love for this person. And years later, let me think how many years later, 45, 47 years later, the guy who beat him up in the bus depot in Rock Hill, Carolina, is watching Barack Obama's inauguration and decides to repent. And he calls up a local reporter and says, I did some terrible things. I now feel terrible about it. Uh, the reporter calls John Lewis for a quote. Lewis talks about, forgiving this man. So this man's name is Elwyn Hill. As a young man, he was part of the KKK in South Carolina. he comes to John Lewis's office to atone, apologize, and John Lewis forgives him, and there are tears. I mean, it's this incredibly powerful moment. So yes, it took decades for this man to come around, but that is, in theory, what's supposed to happen according to this nonviolent philosophy. That ultimately people do come to see the error of their hateful ways.
And to me, when you think about the 1960s, one of the things that comes to my mind is idealism, you know? And to me, what could be more idealistic than this belief in this nonviolent Gandhian creed? Um, and so, in a way, when you talk about origin stories about the the idealism of the 60s, I really think it kind of starts in those workshops, in Nashville. I mean, okay, where's ground zero for all this? It's Nashville. And Thomas Wolfe likes to write about sort of these origin moments. And I kind of feel like, at least for me, these people kind of invent a decade, and it starts right here, right at this little spot on the planet with Lawson, and of course Lewis and his roommate, who's still with us, Bernard Lafayette, and others. So
It
I'm
was an incredible group, this Nashville group, and like I said, the very first sit-ins are a few days earlier by a different group, but
right.
they too have a local minister who's active in King's Group, LCLC, and For the Fellowship on Reconciliation, a guy named Doug Moore. So Doug Moore calls up James Lawson, who's in Nashville, and says, "Can you help?" And Lawson has this huge cadre of students who are ready to go. They've been actually doing practice sit-ins for months before. So the only reason they hadn't done anything more was it was the new semester, and they just sort of hadn't gotten around to it.
Right.
Then a little bit later that spring, they organized what's called SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, with representatives from all of these different campuses, cities where sit-ins had been staged. And um, if if you get the accounts of what happens at that first SNCC meeting, everybody says it's the Nashville group that was the most um, organized, the most disciplined, the most devoted. There were other important groups too, from Atlanta, from Washington, D.C., around Howard University. But the Nashville group then produces all these important leaders. John Lewis is the most famous of them, but Marion Barry, who goes on to be mayor of Washington, had sort of a
Yeah.
sorry end, but had did some important things in the meantime. Um, as you said, Bernard Lafayette, who had a long career um, with nonviolence. He actually goes back at one point as president of the university, the seminary that they all
Baptist.
attended.
Yes.
Um,
Right.
Diane Nash, who goes to work for King, James Bevel, who goes to work for King. They get married, and a whole bunch of others too. Some of whose names aren't as well known to us, and went on to have careers in other places. I talked to a woman named Angeline Butler who went on to have a career in music and as a musicologist, but for whom those early years with workshops with James Lawson in Kelly Miller Smith's church. He was the minister in Nashville who led them. It was such a formative experience for them that really set the tone of this nonviolent movement that would, over the next 5 years, really transform America.
The guy that really, as I wrote my own screenplay, that sort of gobbled up the scenery, was the most fun to write, was Bevel, because he's out catting looking for that satin doll, and you got a romance with this good girl from Fisk out of Chicago, and it's a romance that's forged out of their passion, maybe not so much for each other but for the movement that they were part of. So that often happens in political campaigns and movie sets, where these highly kind of charged experiences people bond, and then when they end it's like, well, I have nothing in common with you. That was sort of my take, on this. um
Yeah. And and sad to say their marriage did end, you know, uh because they ultimately were so different. I mean, Bevel, you know, I don't know if today we would say he was manic. Uh, he was this incredibly eccentric figure, very charismatic. When he goes to work for Dr. King, he is the one who, in the Birmingham campaign of 1963, kind of convinces King that we need to use the school children to help galvanize people, which is very controversial, putting these kids in harm's way.
mhm.
But it turns out to be sort of a stroke of genius. And so Bevel is yeah, but he's drinking, he's womanizing, he's unfaithful to Diane Nash.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, it's right.
within a number of years, they divorce, and he kind of comes to a sorry end. There's a number of sort of
Yes.
sad and upsetting episodes that lie ahead in his future. But for the time, while he was able to hold it together, he was really a great force in the movement.
Yes, a genius and a character who kind of chews the scenery for me, becomes sort of the most compelling. John Lewis is unique, but his at least in the period that I wrote about, his cards are sort of face down emotionally. He's taking these beatings and he's kind of like feeling this religious connection. One thing I wanted to talk about is his political education, because the art of being in the Congress is, you're lucky to get a third or half of what you're trying for. And sometimes you just have to accept the imperfect and take the first down as opposed to the touchdown. And I kind of
Right.
felt like he was learning those lessons at SNCC. He becomes president of SNCC. He ultimately has to yield to his former prison roommate, Stokely Carmichael. And this is a question I have for you, because my memory's failing me. Was he at the political convention in 1964, which was the ultimate lesson in hardball American politics, in Atlantic City?
Yeah, he absolutely is there in Atlantic City in 1964. And just to sort of review for listeners, he and others from SNCC had spent the summer, much of the summer in Mississippi, and even many of the preceding months in Mississippi, organizing Black Mississippians to try to vote. Now, the local Democratic Party was racist through and through. They would not allow Blacks to vote. And so they staged an alternate convention
Right.
and they elected their own delegates, and so they had a whole delegation of John Lewis and others used the word indigenous. Now these days it's used to refer to American Indians, Native Americans, but meaning native Mississippians. So these weren't like students like John Lewis and Diane Ash, but these were people who lived their lives as sharecroppers, domestic workers, what have you, getting organized. And so they elect a slate and they come to Atlantic City where the Democrats are having their convention. Lyndon Johnson is going to be nominated in his own right, having inherited the presidency from Kennedy, the 1963.
Hmm.
And Johnson is just really afraid that this chaos over seating this black delegation, even though he knows they're deserving, but he's afraid that this chaos is going to be disruptive, going to harm his path to election, re-election, you could say, but formally election. And in retrospect, Johnson wins in a landslide. We say, well, what was he thinking about? Why was he so worried? But that spring, George Wallace had done kind of shockingly well in primaries in places like Maryland and Wisconsin. Barry Goldwater had sort of taken over the Republican Party with this agenda that was opposed to the Civil Rights Act. And it's like, really? Because back then, the Republican Party, there were a lot of Republicans like Nelson Rockefeller who had been planning to run in 64 to the left of Kennedy on civil rights or to the left of Johnson. And so to have these right wingers take over, that was scary. Then you had the Harlem riots and a lot of urban violence that summer. So Johnson was not, it wasn't just his ego. He had some reason to sort of worry that a rocky convention could be disruptive to his path to reelection. Turned out to be wrong, but it was not completely unfounded. So
Go ahead.
long story short, there's many days of negotiating. People like Hubert Humphrey and Walter Mondale deeply involved, liberals who believe in the Black freedom cause, but who also are kind of under strict orders from LBJ not to rock the boat. The compromise plan that's presented would seat two of these. I forget the overall number of delegates, but only two of the delegation, make the others honorary delegates, but then stipulate for future conventions you must have integrated delegations. So that was actually the real victory, although nobody could appreciate it because it felt like that's 4 years away. So John Lewis and most of the others leave Atlantic City very discouraged. They vote against. I mean, John didn't vote himself, but the Mississippi Freedom Party, as they were called, votes against this compromise, saying, we're not going to take these honorary seats and like sit up in the balcony like we have to in the movie theaters in the South. I mean, that's what Aaron Henry, one of the members, said. So they were having none of it. In the long run, there there was kind of a victory that set the Democratic Party on a path toward being a more integrated, diverse, equal opportunity party.
As an aside, I just want you to know that I am wearing my Lyndon Johnson open road Stetson as
Oh
we
yeah,
speak. This was Lyndon's thing. I kind of go like this, the little adjustment, but it is his open road hat. I often felt that I didn't write the script that I wrote did not include that. My script ends at Parchman, at the end of Parchman, as the young students converge on this prison because they're just
right.
shepherded into this work farm. But I felt as I read more, and if I was going to do like a long form thing, that the story could also end at Atlantic City because this is really where he gets this message in hardcore politics. Great, we dig your friggin' idealism. Get in line. This is America. This is politics, and that's a real. I felt like that's it. That's the lesson. It was a Mondale, Humphrey, and I think William Kunstler. There's a whole group of people that converge in back rooms.
Right. Walter Reuter of the UAW, the labor leader. Um, there's, yeah. Um, and the irony is, Lewis really, even in his memoir, kind of sticks by the narrative of feeling betrayed and that it was correct to reject the compromise, which, of course, you know, none of us is really in a position to second guess him. But there were others, including importantly Bayard Rustin, who was a key mentor to John Lewis. Rustin argues, look, you've chosen to enter the arena of politics. That is the arena of compromise. So there's no point in coming here saying we want to play politics at the Democratic convention and then saying we're going to stand on principle and rebuff the compromise. And even though in this particular case, he doesn't persuade Lewis, Lewis does come to share Rustin's view of politics as a viable arena for continuing the work of the movement, particularly after the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act, these two enormously transformative pieces of legislation that John Lewis and his brothers and sisters in SNCC and SCLC have directly helped to bring about. The questions then become, how does progress continue? A lot of it is stuff that maybe can't be galvanized through street protest. And like a lot of his peers, comes to see politics, elective office, because now with blacks in the South being able to vote, they can elect black representatives, and it starts at the local level, mayors and city councils, but then soon, members of Congress and so on. Um, that this is really the vehicle for change. There's some people in SNCC who remain purists, who, even though they might be undiminished in their affection for John Lewis, view his choice to become a major player in the National Democratic Party, with some suspicion, selling out, something like that. But there are lots of others who follow the Bayard Rustin blueprint. He writes an article called From Protest to Politics. And that sort of becomes a blueprint for Andy Young, Marion Barry, a whole generation. James Clyburn, who's still in the Congress, he wasn't deeply involved in SNCC the way Lewis was, but he had been in his local chapter. So there's a whole generation that says, yes, this is the way forward. And throughout his career, Lewis often says, I see my work in Congress, even though some people see it as very different, I see it as a continuation of my work in the movement.
That's so interesting. So, when you think back through the lens of 1964, you can also see sort of these big dividing lines as the Democratic Party starts to become more inclusive. Actually, the Republican Party still has connections to Lincoln and civil rights, as you mentioned, Nelson Rockefeller and others. There were many blacks who felt a connection to the Republican Party more than they could ever imagine
Right.
to the Democratic Party. After all, the Democratic Party is the party of slavery, the party of secession. All these things are embedded, but it starts to change there. And of course, as you mentioned, Lyndon Johnson was very fearful that he was going to lose his base, the South. He was a Southerner. And as you mentioned, with Wallace coming on the rise, and, he'd seen the Dixiecrats in 48. So there's all these tectonic, it's like the first, fissure in these uh, tectonic kind of plates. And I might add, as you were talking, that basically as these blacks are back in the electorate, it's picking up where Reconstruction left off, because after
Right.
all, there were blacks in government during the decade or so after the Civil War. There was a tremendous interest in participation in American politics by blacks. There was a stereotype, a false one, that blacks were basically indifferent or didn't care or wouldn't vote. No, it was the opposite. So I don't know. To me, that's all very interesting
Yeah.
looking backward. And of course, Barack Obama is the living example of taking a first down if you can't throw a touchdown. Let's take the yardage. The Affordable Care Act is a classic example, and there's others. And as you mentioned, I think Lewis took those lessons. Sometimes they're bitter.
Yeah, and he always, as he would say, kept his eyes on the prize. I mean, he had these phrases he would just repeat his whole career: "Keep the faith, keep your eyes on the prize." He would say, "Don't give out, don't give in, don't give up." Um, so it's not as though he lost his idealism, but he did come to appreciate how you get things done in politics. Another kind of little known chapter in his political education, I think, comes in his years on the city council of Atlanta, which, I kind of already sort of suspect listeners are going to be switching off, but it's actually a fascinating story. Um, he's there basically for one term, and he comes in as Mr. Ethics, because there's like a lot of city councils, a lot of corruption, and people are allowed to have other jobs and other deals on the side. And because he's so kind of adamant about not tolerating this, not tolerating that, particularly on the part of the city council chairman, a guy named Marvin Arrington, he kind of isolates himself. And he's not all that effective as city councilman, because everybody thinks you're going around saying you're not bought and paid for it. You're implying that all the rest of us are. and um and so he sort of learns you can be too righteous, too isolated, and that it is important if you're working in a legislative body, whether it's city council or later in Congress, say, okay, we'll make a deal, we'll compromise, and as you and I are talking. It's February 2024, and the House of Representatives, led by a dysfunctional Republican Party, has just voted down a compromise that they themselves had demanded,
Right.
with sort of over border security being tied to aid to Ukraine and Israel. And it's just an example of how politics can't function if you're not willing to make compromises. And Lewis did learn this, and I think those city council years in Atlanta actually were an important time, a lesser known time in the biography of John Lewis, when he came to appreciate that.
Well, it takes a little grease sometimes to make those wheels move. And as I like to say when I talk politics with my friends, I go, listen, pal, Jesus ain't on the ballot. So you better pick somebody, and that's just the way it goes. There's so many lessons. Do you have a title for the book?
It's a simple title, John Lewis, A Life.
Okay.
Uh, the thinking is people aren't buying the book because of me. People aren't buying the book because I'm making some really special claim about John Lewis. This is going to be, I say with all due modesty, I think the definitive life of John Lewis, at least for some time to come. And so we want readers to just appreciate what they're going to be encountering.
In your process, to what extent is his own biography, Walking with the Wind, helpful or a hindrance?
It's a great question. I mean, it's a wonderful memoir, and of all the civil rights memoirs, I think it's one of the very best. Um, and so, in many ways, it was a great help, both in sort of helping me identify key moments in his life and how he thought and felt about those moments. Um, but then also in saying, well, what is not here that needs to be told? Among other things, it basically ends when he gets to Congress. There's a few pages about his congressional career thus far. The book was published in the 90s, so
Right.
we had a lot of ways to go. But I also found in my research a lot of mistakes, and I'm sure all memoirs have this. Um, and with no disrespect to John Lewis or Mike Dorso, who was his co-writer on it,
Mhm.
wonderful writer and journalist, just maybe didn't have access to some of the things I was able to get. Nowadays, for example, lots and lots of newspapers um, are online, full text searchable from your own desk.
Right.
So, in looking through the Selma Times Journal, I actually found that there's one incident in October '63 in Selma. So, this is like about 15 months before the big Selma showdown.
Right.
There's there's already, let's see, was it October '63 or '64? It was '63, I think. They have what's called Freedom Day, so it's more than 12 months. But and on Freedom Day, John Lewis describes it in some detail, as if he's there. And then I sort of realized this sort of tracks this article I read in the New Republic, and it tracks this. But where's his own what he did? And then from looking at the Times Journal, the Selma newspaper, he was in jail. He misremembered. So he was describing these events as if he was watching them. He was actually in jail. Now they had other days that fall when they were doing voter registration, so he must have been mixing it up with a different day. I found a number of things like that. Another great little bit I found. Um, there's a famous story in 1965 during the Selma campaign. Martin Luther King is in Selma the night that Lyndon Johnson gives his famous speech to Congress in support of a voting rights bill where he says, "We shall overcome." And a tear rolls down Martin Luther King's
Yeah.
cheek.
A very famous deer.
So, in the early accounts from John Lewis, John Lewis says, "I heard that Dr. King cried that night." People said King cried that night. Later, he seems to place himself at the home of Sullivan Jackson and say, "Oh yeah, I saw Dr. King cry that night, or I was there." And he wasn't there. I don't think he was lying. He wouldn't. He's not the kind of man who would do that. He needs no aggrandizing. I think he, after telling this story many times, kind of create a little memory for himself. So anyway, you do your own research and you get down to the primary sources and you find, I'm sure this is true of every memoir and probably true of every history book, people get things wrong, little details. And so in some ways it's can be gratifying to come along, not in a gotcha way, but just to kind of correct the record, say, aha, the date of the call from Doug Moore to James Lawson was March 10th, or February 10th, not February 3rd, or
Yeah,
something like that.
big
Which
breakthrough.
again, yeah, matters to some people, may not matter to the average reader very much.
A great book I read, if in kind of the backstory of Selma, is when Bernard Lafayette's book, and he talks about arriving there with Bevel, and this kid gets killed, and I mean they're shotgun shacked, and really in the harshest sort of piece of Klan-fed Alabama, Selma, they're trying to carve this out, some progress, and it's a year or so before it explodes
Right,
on the Pettus
right.
Bridge.
Yeah, Bernard's one of the first people to go in. I think he's there maybe July of '63, June of '63. The
Right,
Pettus Bridge is March '65. So
right.
there's a long campaign. Um, it's not just SNCC, there's also a group called the Dallas County Voters League, Dallas County being the name of the county that contained Selma and the adjacent cities. And so yeah, they were pushing this hard. There was this famous adversary in Sheriff Jim Clark who
Right.
just was cruel and used electric cattle prods on the protesters and would make young kids march like on a prison line, on a dirt road out of town. So it's those local African American activists, again, not just, I mean, the SNCC and SCLC people deserve credit, but so do kind of those local activists who are sort of fighting that fight every day.
Who you never know unless you, as a historian, just start walking the streets and talking to old people, and they'll come out. You'll find them. When we talk about historians, one of the people I admire is, of course, Robert Caro, and the work he did with Lyndon. Uh,
Right. Still doing.
I know. Well, yeah, I'm waiting. I haven't read the last one. I did read a book about his writing of Lyndon Johnson, and I'm going to just toot my own horn for the few that might see this. Is that I wrote a script called Ballot Box 13 because I went
Oh,
down to
nice.
those southern counties in Texas and researched many of this and spoke to many of the same people and wrote a script called Ballot Box 13 about how you get power in America.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know where I was going with this. But one of the last thoughts I have is to what extent, because we're talking about politics and compromise and this Gandhian idea that animates really the beginning of his journey, meaning nonviolence and satyagraha, to what degree do you think that because some of his votes were in favor of military intervention in the later part of his career. To what point do you think that he came off of that or compromised it or felt differently about it? Because I'm going to add this caveat. I struggle with this personally. Um, when you're dealing with like social injustices, segregation, with an imminently more powerful adversary, nonviolence as a tool, this kind of organization, is at once is morally right, but also it has a tremendous strategic value. But when you get into this other dimension where you have a genocidal assault of one people against another, whether it's in Ukraine and the Soviet and the Russians, or it was, in Germany, in the before world during World War II,
Right.
or even sadly now in Gaza. Does this stuff still hold up? And that's where personally I'm at a loss.
Right. Well, I think he was actually quite principled in almost always opposing military intervention, even voting regularly against defense budgets in a kind of symbolic way. But he did make exceptions. One of his staffers said to me that during the Kosovo um, genocide or assault, he said to her, I want you to figure out what's the right thing to do, not what the politically right thing to do, what's the right thing to do. He ended up supporting the American intervention in Kosovo. The three ones where I think I saw him supporting um, military intervention were Somalia under George Bush Sr., sort of toward
Mhm.
the end of Bush's, when there was sort of the famine and it was really a humanitarian relief mission. And Lewis went over to sort of see things firsthand as part of a congressional delegation. Then Kosovo, and then Afghanistan. He did not support the Bush Jr.'s war in Iraq, but he did support the Afghanistan. I think today people kind of lump them together, but those were very different votes. One was about getting a terrorist mastermind and the regime that was protecting him. The other was a separate geopolitical question that sort of flowed from the war on terrorism, but you know, in the view of a lot of people, was not properly part and parcel of the war on terrorism. I think on genocide, I do think intervening to stop genocide, as in Serbia, you know, uh, uh, against Kosovo or against Bosnia, is he would say that is a proper use. I think when people use it in Gaza, it's a politicized really distortion of what the term is, which is an intent to wipe out a people, which of course is not what's going on in Gaza. And Lewis was actually, throughout his career, a really great friend of Israel and sort of saw Israel. Um, and many people don't see it this way anymore, but he saw Israel as a kind of endangered nation that was surrounded by enemies, that was a liberal democracy and an American ally, that did go to war sometimes, but always reluctantly, if not strictly speaking, defensively. Um, so, I don't know what his position on that would have been today. Probably somewhere where Joe Biden is, which is lending support to Israel while also expressing concern for casualties in Gaza. But it was interesting to see the picture of John Lewis as like a pacifist did not really hold up. Like he wasn't uniformly against military intervention, but he always had a very good reason when he did support it.
So it wasn't he was not ultimately an absolutist on those issues. I think I just was reviewing before I spoke with you that he felt that Israel was almost like it's the last outpost of democracy as you moved into that region of the world. I suspect he would feel similarly, but with more uh, reservations today. I want to kind of wrap this up. One of the big kind of connections in the civil rights movement was this common cause between Jewish people, liberal Jewish
Yeah.
people of like-minded sort of beliefs, and who made common cause with Black people. Some of that has suffered and been shattered and reassembled. Uh, your thoughts?
Well, John Lewis would always say that in the Congress, the sort of there was never formally a Jewish caucus, but the Jewish members and the Congressional Black Caucus were the tightest of allies. And he himself often would organize these groups of Black and Jewish members. Um, that he felt that there were forces within the Black movement, and probably to some extent, on the Jewish side too. These were kind of the people he had warred with back in the day in the 60s. So this was not the Martin Luther King faction. This was like the Stokely Carmichael faction that had a more, in some cases anti-Semitic, but in some cases just, well, why do we need to be allies with the Jews kind of set of attitudes? Our allies are with revolutionary movements around the world. Lewis was radical in his belief in nonviolence and satyagraha and the beloved community, but he was a liberal in his politics, and so his politics in that sense, and those of I think most African Americans. Look, you know, the African American community elected Bill Clinton, elected Obama, elected Joe Biden. African American politics, by and large, are not as left-wing radical as those of some people who purport to be their spokesman. Those people speak, I think, for a segment of Black opinion, and it's a real and significant one. But I think today it's sort of the same thing. That Lewis would say, you look past the vocal, um, uh, media celebrity activists, and you look at on the ground, like who's in the Congressional Black Caucus, look at mayors, look at Black governors and senators, that the connections with the Jewish community remain pretty strong. Look, there's certain issues. Obviously, affirmative action over the years has been one where there have been differences. There was a period where Israel was trading and selling arms with South Africa, and that understandably, ran afoul of Black opinion. In fact, that's one incident where Lewis said the congressional kind of Black-Jewish alliance helped to solve the problem, that the Black members said, okay, we won't make too public a fuss about it and the Jewish members said, we're going to work on the Israeli leadership. And sure enough, in time, the Israeli leadership came around and joined the global sanctions against South Africa and joined that movement to isolate South Africa. So again, that's an example of pragmatic politics prevailing.
Yeah.
But he always had, very strong support from both Black and white, including Jewish constituents in his district, and was mindful. He would say things like, in the North, like if you take someone like John Conyers, who represented Detroit for a long time, Conyers had pretty much an all-Black, mostly Black district. That can dictate one set of politics. Lewis represented an Atlanta district that was really racially mixed. And so did a lot of other Southern African American representatives. So their politics were a little different from those of, a Harlem representative, a Detroit, or other who represent, the northern Black communities. And you see those differences emerge in a number of places over the years.
I wrote about that actually in my script because when they end up in Parchment, I believe this is true, but his cellmate John Lewis's cellmate becomes Stokely Carmichael. So I said, well, here's the debates, Lewis is reading the Bible and he turns to Stokely. this is my own invention, He said,
right.
Yeah. But I read Stokely's accounts of these things in those, it's a great, The Negro in America. I forget the name of the book. Is that guy who was a famous writer from Nashville. But he said, you ought to check this book out, the Bible. And Stokely looks at him and goes, well, I'll read the Bible if you listen to what's his name, the great horn player, Love Supreme,
Coltrane.
Yeah, you listen to Coltrane, I'll check out the Bible. You've these two very different traditions that are one is urban and one is out of the church in the South, and clearly,
Yeah. And I mean, look, I could go on uh for a long time about this, but the in SNCC, like I said, the Nashville faction, which was really church bred and oriented toward nonviolence and Gandhi and Jesus and Christian teachings, was a key faction. But there was also this faction coming out of Howard University, which called itself the Nonviolent Action Group. So they were on paper for nonviolence and included Stokely Carmichael,
right,
a brilliant leader named Cortlandt Cox, a number of others, some of whom became among Lewis's closest friends. But their orientation was more, um, not religious. Um, in some ways, as you might say, Marxist. I mean, I don't want to say they're communist because I don't think anyone were Communist Party affiliated, but a more radical economic based critique that you associate with cities, with the North. Um, and they saw the problem less as desegregation and about economic equality. So, and Lewis thought those were problems too. But anyway, it's just interesting to see they're both sort of legitimate strains of African American thought and protest, and they kind of collide within the organization of SNCC.
right,
It's not just one organization versus a different one. It's not just King versus Malcolm X. It's
right.
within SNCC you see both of these strains and which is going to prevail at which moment.
And sadly for white people that were in SNCC, one of whom I just did a podcast with, Bob Zellner, they, at the end of its journey, of the SNCC journey, were sort of exiled from the group. And
Yeah, and Lewis had left already. Probably had been gone more than a year
right,
when that happened. He had seen it heading in this direction toward black separatism, black nationalism, which was never his way. He was always an integrationist. He always believed, whites should be a part of the movement, working with whites and so on. But yeah, at that time, at that moment, 66, 67, um, that vision of Lewis and King was getting very hard to sustain.
of course, there's a war raging now, Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson's in the crosshairs, and assassinations are coming, and it becomes this brief shining moment, is from, like, I don't know where it ends. I think it ends in 65 or 4. I don't know, but the world gets different. It gets more complicated. It gets more brutal,
Right.
and some of the idealism that they could fully embrace at the beginning of the decade is way more difficult as we move into the second half of it. David, this is too much fun. I feel like I'm getting the benefit of the graduate seminar I never got after I left UC Berkeley. I want people to. When do you think this book, your John Lewis book, is going to hit the shelves?
October 2024. So, just about 8 months from now.
Okay. And what are you going to be doing between then and now in terms of raising awareness for it, or how do you do that?
Yeah, well, still a few T's to cross and I's to dot. The book's not quite finished, copy editing and all of that. Um, I'll be giving a few lectures, doing a little more talking about it, and then, come the fall, um, I trust that my folks at Simon and Schuster, which is publishing the book, will help give it a good launch. I hope to, go to many of the cities where John Lewis made a lasting imprint: Nashville, Atlanta, Washington D.C., as well as wherever there's an interest in John Lewis, which I think is far and wide.
Well, an early congratulations on a worthwhile subject. And I look forward to reading it. And I can just tell, talking to you, you have a mastery of the subject. And I think there's relevance to the current moment. And what that moment will be in October of this year, it might be entirely different than it is now.
Very hard to say, and without giving away the ending of the book, I left it a little open ended. There when I finished the last chapter, when John Lewis ended his life, and now this country has some big choices before it of which path it wants to go down. And it's not resolved. We remain a very divided nation. And I can at least envision, our choosing a path much like John Lewis would have wanted. But I can also envision, some of the darker, uglier sides of Americans prevailing. So the fact that this book is coming out in election season, maybe it will at least help people think about the choices before us.
Yeah, well, Lewis is a light. He is a light, and he's a real man. He's a real person, and it seems just from my own sort of reading, there's an arc of growth and awareness and wisdom within his own life. So I'm sure you've captured it, David. This is too much fun. Um, I want to thank you for your scholarship and your time, and stay on the other side of this little video as I bid adieu to my throng of loyal history interested people. So, folks, thanks for joining me. This is David Greenberg. Look out later in the year for John Lewis, A Life, and check out some of the other writings rather, that David has written about. I'm sure you'll see him soon on YouTube and other places as he gets closer to publication. Till next time, namaste, shalom, and aloha. By that I mean namashaloha. See ya.